The grand ballroom of the Galactic Trade Station sparkled with crystalline decorations that caught the light from 3 different suns. Representatives from dozens of worlds had gathered for what many considered the social event of the century. The marriage ceremony between Princess Zara of the mighty Corvellian Empire and her chosen mate would seal one of the most important political alliances in recent galactic history. Zara stood at the center of attention, her blue-scaled skin gleaming under the lights, her 4 arms adorned with traditional golden bands that marked her royal status. At 7 feet tall, she commanded respect from every species present. The Corvellians had ruled over 43 star systems for over 2,000 years, and their military might was legendary throughout the galaxy. "I still cannot believe she chose a human," whispered Ambassador Thekmar of the Regellian Consortium, his tentacles twitching with barely concealed amusement. "Of all the worthy suitors from powerful civilizations, she picks a creature from that backwater planet." The vegan trade minister nodded her massive head in agreement, her 6 eyes blinking in sequence. "Humans have only been in space for 50 of their years. They have no real technology, no significant military, no vast territories. What could they possibly offer the Corvellian Empire?" Around them, other delegates murmured similar thoughts. The humans were known throughout the galaxy as a young species, barely past their first interstellar flights. Their homeworld, Earth, was small and unremarkable. Their technology was primitive compared to civilizations that had been exploring space for millennia. Most galactic powers viewed them as curiosities at best, irrelevant at worst. "Perhaps it is some kind of experiment," suggested the crystalline representative from Andromeda Prime, his voice chiming like broken glass. "The Corvellians have always been unconventional in their scientific pursuits." Princess Zara heard every whispered comment, every barely concealed snicker, every dismissive gesture. Her enhanced hearing was one of many Corvellian advantages that other species often forgot about. But she showed no reaction, maintaining the dignified posture expected of royalty. Inside, however, she felt a mixture of anger and anticipation. These fools had no idea what they were talking about. They looked at humans and saw only what they wanted to see: a weak, young species with nothing to offer. They had not bothered to look deeper to understand what made humans truly dangerous. They would learn soon enough. The ceremony was set to begin when the human delegation arrived. Zara had specifically requested that her husband-to-be make his entrance last, after all the other dignitaries were seated. She wanted everyone to see him, to witness this moment that would change everything. "Look at her," laughed Senator Crix of the Centauri Federation, his scales rattling with mirth. "She actually looks excited about this farce. What spell has this primitive human cast over our mighty princess?" The mockery grew bolder as the minutes passed. Some delegates had clearly been drinking the fermented Altarian spirits being served, and their comments became increasingly crude. They spoke of humans as if they were pets or curiosities, making jokes about their short lifespans, their fragile bodies, their limited understanding of the universe. High Commander Vex of the Draconian Military Alliance was perhaps the most vocal critic. Standing nearly 9 feet tall, with armor-like skin and multiple weapon attachments, he represented one of the most feared military forces in the galaxy. "This is what happens when a civilization becomes too comfortable," he declared loudly enough for most of the room to hear. "The Corvellians have grown soft, making alliances with creatures that should be in zoos, not marriage chambers. Perhaps it is time for new leadership in this sector." His words carried an unmistakable threat. Several other military representatives nodded in agreement. The implication was clear. If the Corvellian Empire was making such poor decisions, perhaps their dominance was coming to an end. Princess Zara's personal guard shifted uncomfortably. They were trained warriors, but even they seemed uncertain about the wisdom of this alliance. The princess had refused to explain her choice beyond saying that the delegates would understand soon enough. The great doors at the far end of the ballroom began to open with a deep, resonant sound that cut through the conversations. All eyes turned toward the entrance as the human delegation was announced. Most expected to see a small group of nervous diplomats in whatever primitive formal were humans considered appropriate for such an occasion. Instead, the first figure through the door was a woman in a crisp military uniform, her bearing suggesting high rank despite her relatively small stature. Behind her came a dozen other humans, all wearing similar uniforms, all moving with the precise coordination of a well-trained unit. Admiral Sarah Chun, representing the Terran Federation Navy, announced the protocol droid in its emotionless voice. The conversations in the room died down slightly. Admiral was a significant rank, even by galactic standards, but the human military was considered a joke by most present. What could a few primitive warships do against fleets that had been perfected over millennia? But as more humans entered, the nature of the delegation became clear. These were not diplomats or trade representatives. Every single human wore a military uniform. Scientists, engineers, tacticians, fleet commanders, all military personnel. "Where are their diplomatic corps?" whispered Ambassador Thekmar, his tentacles now still with uncertainty. "Perhaps they don't have any," replied the vegan minister, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. The procession continued for several minutes, with humans of various ranks and specializations entering in perfect formation. Their equipment, while unfamiliar to most species present, had a distinctly functional, military appearance. There was something about the way they moved, the way they observed everything around them, that suggested these were not the primitive beings the galaxy had assumed them to be. Finally, the last figure appeared in the doorway, and the entire ballroom fell into complete silence. The man who entered was clearly the one Princess Zura had chosen as her mate, but nothing about him matched what the delegates had expected. He wore no uniform, no ceremonial dress, no symbols of rank or office. Instead, he was dressed in simple, dark clothing that somehow made him more imposing rather than less. He was not particularly large by galactic standards, perhaps 6 feet tall, with a typical human build. His hair was dark, his features unremarkable by human standards. But his eyes held something that every warrior in the room recognized, something that transcended species and culture. They held the absolute confidence of someone who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious. They held the cold calculation of a predator who had never met an equal. As he walked slowly across the vast ballroom toward Princess Zura, his footsteps echoing in the silence, every instinct that had kept these various species alive for millennia began screaming warnings. This was not prey. This was not some primitive creature to be dismissed. This was something far more dangerous. The Draconian High Commander's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon before stopping. His armor's threat assessment systems were giving readings that didn't make sense. How could a single, unarmored human register as a significant threat? Princess Zara smiled for the first time since the ceremony began, and her smile held secrets that made the assembled delegates suddenly very uncomfortable. She knew something they didn't, something about this human, something about the species everyone had been so eager to mock. The human stopped 3 feet from Princess Zura and gave a slight bow, not the deep, submissive genuflection expected from someone marrying into galactic royalty, but the measured acknowledgement of one equal greeting another. When he straightened, his eyes swept the assembled crowd with the methodical precision of someone cataloging every potential threat in the room. "Marcus Kane," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space without amplification. "It's an honor to meet you all." The casualness of his introduction sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. Where was the ceremony, the formal presentation of credentials, the lengthy recitation of titles, and achievements that typically accompanied such momentous occasions? High Commander Vex stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the human. "I am High Commander Vex of the Draconian Military Alliance. I commanded fleets when your species was still discovering fire. You will address me with proper respect, little human." Marcus looked up at the 9-foot alien warrior without a trace of intimidation. His expression remained neutral, almost bored. "Commander," he acknowledged with a slight nod, using the truncated rank deliberately. "Nice armor." "Ceremonial?" The insult was subtle, but unmistakable. Vex's armor was indeed his finest ceremonial gear, decorated with honors from a dozen campaigns. But the way Marcus said it made it sound like a costume, a pretense rather than genuine military equipment. "This armor has seen more battles than your pathetic species has fought wars," Vex snarled, his weapon systems beginning to power up with an audible whine. "Has it?" Marcus asked, tilting his head slightly. "When was your last real fight, Commander?" Not some police action against pirates or a show of force against trade rebels. An actual fight against someone who could fight back. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Vex weapon systems were now fully active, their targeting lasers painting red dots across Marcus's chest. Around the room, other military representatives tensed, their own defensive systems activating in response to the rising threat level. Princess Zara made no move to intervene. If anything, she looked more relaxed than she had all evening. You dare question the might of the Draconian Alliance? Vex's voice had dropped to a dangerous growl. We have conquered star systems while your people were still living in caves. Against who? Marcus pressed, his tone remaining conversational despite the weapons trained on him. The Rigelian Consortium? The Vegan Trade Federation? The Centauri Senate? He gestured casually toward the various delegations. When was the last time any of you actually fought a war against an equal opponent? Ambassador Thekmar's tentacles writhed indignantly. The Rigelian vegan conflict lasted 3 years and claimed millions of lives. A trade dispute with military posturing. Marcus replied dismissively. You blockaded shipping lanes and had a few skirmishes over mining rights. That's not war. That's a corporate disagreement with better weapons. The admiral who had led the human delegation stepped forward. Perhaps some context would be helpful, Admiral Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings of all classifications, allow me to properly introduce Marcus Kane. She activated a small device that projected a holographic display above the center of the room. The image that appeared was a star chart showing a region of space that none of the assembled delegates recognized. The stars were arranged in unfamiliar patterns, and the territorial markings used symbols that didn't correspond to any known galactic power. This is the Terran home galaxy, Admiral Chun continued. What you see here represents approximately 43,000 inhabited star systems, divided among several hundred distinct galactic civilizations. The numbers were staggering. The entire known galaxy contained perhaps 50,000 inhabited systems total, and most of those were controlled by the major powers represented in this room. Impossible, declared the crystalline representative from Andromeda Prime. Our deep space surveys have detected no signs of such widespread civilization in that region. Your surveys were looking for technology similar to your own, Admiral Chen replied. Human technology follows different principles. We learned early that broadcasting our presence was an invitation to conquest. She changed the display to show what appeared to be a timeline, with dates and events marked in human notation. For the past 3,000 years, the Terran galaxy has been in a state of continuous warfare. Not trade disputes or territorial squabbles, but absolute warfare. Species fighting for survival, for resources, for the right to exist. The timeline showed conflicts of breathtaking scope and duration. Wars that lasted centuries, battles that consumed entire star systems, genocides that erased civilizations from existence. It was a historical record that made the relatively peaceful expansion of the known galactic powers seem almost quaint by comparison. Marcus Kane, Admiral Chun continued, holds the rank of Fleet Admiral in the Terran Federation Navy. He has commanded fleets in 47 major engagements across a military career spanning 60 years of continuous combat operations. The number hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. 60 years of continuous combat was longer than most of their civilizations had been at war in total across their entire histories. He is the architect of the Proxima Gambit, which ended the Centaurian War. He commanded the defense of the Sol Perimeter during the Machine Uprising. He led the deep strike forces that broke the Hive Queen Alliance at the Battle of Kepler's Gate. Each name was meaningless to the galactic delegates, but the way Admiral Chun spoke of them suggested military actions of enormous significance. Marcus himself showed no reaction to the recitation of his achievements, as if they were simply facts to be acknowledged rather than glorious victories to be celebrated. The Terran Federation, Admiral Chun concluded, emerged victorious from a 3,000-year period of warfare that claimed approximately 4 trillion lives across multiple species. We are what survived when everything else didn't. High Commander Vex's weapon systems were still active, but his hand had moved away from the firing controls. His threat assessment systems were now screaming warnings that his conscious mind was struggling to process. 4 trillion casualties suggested conflicts on a scale that dwarfed anything in recorded galactic history. "You're claiming the humans are some kind of master warrior race?" he asked, his voice less certain than before. Marcus finally spoke again, his tone still conversational. "We're claiming that we're the species that survived a galaxy where everything wanted to kill everything else. That tends to teach you things." He looked around the room at the various delegates, his gaze lingering on each of the major military commanders present. "You've all been very fortunate to live in a galaxy where warfare is the exception rather than the rule, where conflict can be resolved through diplomacy, trade agreements, and limited military actions. It's made you soft." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Soft. The representatives of some of the most powerful military forces in known space had just been called soft by a human they'd been mocking minutes earlier. "Your weapons are designed to intimidate rather than kill efficiently," Marcus continued, nodding toward Vec's elaborate armor system. "Your tactics assume opponents who think like you do, who follow your rules of engagement, who could be reasoned with or deterred. Your entire military philosophy is built on the assumption that your enemies will behave rationally." He smiled for the first time, and there was nothing warm about the expression. "Where we come from, rational enemies were usually the easiest to defeat. It was the desperate ones, the insane ones, the ones with nothing left to lose that taught us how to really fight." Princess Zara stepped closer to Marcus, her own smile matching his. "My dear delegates," she said, her voice carrying a satisfaction that made several of the assembled representatives suddenly very nervous. "Allow me to properly introduce my husband-to-be. Marcus Kane, Supreme Commander of the Terran Expeditionary Force, architect of the Omega Protocols, and the only human to successfully navigate the Kessel Trials." The last title meant nothing to most of the delegates, but Admiral Chen's expression suggested it carried enormous significance among humans. Marcus shot Zara a look that might have been surprise or annoyance, as if she had revealed more than he had intended. "The Corvellian Empire," Princess Zara continued, "has been monitoring Terran space for over 2 decades. We know what humans are capable of when threatened. We know what they've survived, what they've conquered, and what they've sacrificed to reach this point in their development." She gestured toward the assembled delegates with one of her forearms. "We also know that this galaxy is about to face threats that will require the kind of survival skills that only come from experience with true warfare. Diplomatic solutions and trade agreements will not be sufficient for what is coming." The implications of her words sent a chill through the room. The Corvellians were known for their advanced intelligence networks and their ability to predict galactic trends decades in advance. If they were preparing for major conflicts, it meant they had detected threats that others had missed. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted completely. What began as a social gathering with barely concealed mockery had become something much more serious. The delegates who had been drinking and laughing were now silent, their attention focused entirely on the revelations unfolding before them. Senator Crix of the Centauri Federation stepped forward, his earlier amusement replaced by concern. "Princess Zara, what threats are you referring to? Our intelligence networks have detected no significant military buildups or hostile activities in any of the known sectors." Princess Zara exchanged a glance with Marcus before activating her own holographic display. The image that appeared showed a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy, with various civilizations marked in different colors. But at the edges of the map, beyond the territories of all known powers, were darker regions marked with symbols that radiated menace even without explanation. "For the past 50 years, Zara began, our deep space monitoring stations have been tracking movement in the Outer Rim territories. Ships using technology we don't recognize, following patrol patterns that suggest coordinated intelligence gathering operations." The map zoomed in on specific regions, showing tracking data that painted a disturbing picture. Massive vessels appeared at the edge of sensor range, observed various star systems, then disappeared using faster-than-light methods that left no detectable traces. "3 months ago, we lost contact with our listening post in the Omega sector," Zara continued. "When we sent a patrol to investigate, we found the entire system stripped of all useful materials. Planets mined down to their cores, asteroids processed into raw elements, even the star itself showing signs of artificial modification. The implications were staggering. Strip mining an entire star system required technology and resources on an almost incomprehensible scale. It suggested a civilization with both the ability and the willingness to consume everything in their path. How long would such an operation take? Asked the vegan trade minister, her 6 eyes all focused on the display. Marcus answered, his voice clinical and precise. Based on the efficiency pattern Zara showed me, approximately 18 standard months to completely process a system of that size. That level of resource extraction suggests either a civilization preparing for massive expansion or one that consumes resources at a rate that requires constant acquisition of new territory. High Commander Vex had finally deactivated his weapon systems, but his posture remained tense. Why wasn't this information shared with the Galactic Defense Council? Because the Galactic Defense Council consists of civilizations that haven't fought a real war in generations, Zara replied bluntly. Your response would have been to send diplomatic envoys to establish communication and trade relationships. Our analysis suggests that approach would result in the complete extinction of galactic civilization within 50 years. Admiral Chun stepped forward and activated another display, this one showing technical readouts and battle simulations. We've been able to analyze some of the technology traces left behind in the Omega sector. The energy signatures suggest weapons capable of cracking planetary crusts from interplanetary distances. Their ships appear to be capable of sustained faster-than-light travel without requiring rest stops or refueling. She gestured to another section of the display. Most concerning is evidence of what appears to be automated warfare systems. Self-replicating combat units that can adapt to enemy tactics in real time. If our analysis is correct, they don't just conquer systems, they convert them into manufacturing bases for more war machines. The silence that followed was profound. Every military commander in the room was running calculations in their head, trying to assess how their forces would fare against such overwhelming technological advantages. The results were not encouraging. So you're saying, Ambassador Thekmar said slowly, his tentacles barely moving, that we're facing an invasion by a civilization that treats entire star systems as consumable resources, has technology decades ahead of our own, and employs automated warfare on a scale we can't match. That's exactly what we're saying, Marcus confirmed. And based on the pattern of their movements, they'll reach the outer territories of known space within 10 to 15 years. The crystalline representative's voice chimed with distress. Surely there must be some defensive strategy, some way to negotiate or deter them from aggressive action. Marcus and Admiral Chun exchanged a look that conveyed volumes of shared experience. Deterrence only works against opponents who value their own survival more than their objectives, Marcus said. Negotiation requires common ground and mutual understanding. From what we've observed of their operations, these beings appear to view other civilizations the same way most species view asteroid fields, as obstacles to be cleared and resources to be harvested. Princess Zara moved closer to the center of the room, commanding attention from all the assembled delegates. This is why the Corvellian Empire has chosen to align with humanity. Not because we find them politically useful or economically advantageous, but because they are the only civilization in known space with experience fighting total war against technologically superior opponents. She gestured toward Marcus and the human delegation. They have spent 3 millennia developing tactics, strategies, and technologies specifically designed for survival against overwhelming odds. They understand concepts that our civilizations have never needed to learn. Concepts like acceptable casualties, strategic sacrifice, and victory through superior brutality rather than superior firepower. The words hung heavy in the air. Acceptable casualties and strategic sacrifice were phrases that made most of the assembled delegates uncomfortable. Their civilizations had grown powerful through diplomacy, trade, and limited conflicts where casualties were minimized and objectives were achieved through overwhelming technological advantage rather than willingness to endure losses. High Commander Vex was the first to voice the question that everyone was thinking. What exactly are you proposing? That we restructure our entire military philosophy based on the threat assessment of one civilization? I'm proposing that you listen to the only people in this room who have survived the kind of conflict that's coming, Zara replied. Marcus has agreed to share Terran military doctrine and tactical innovations with the Galactic Defense Council. In exchange, we want full cooperation in implementing new defensive strategies and complete authority over military operations when the invasion begins. The demands were enormous. Complete military authority meant that human commanders would potentially outrank generals and admirals who had spent centuries building their reputations and positions. It meant accepting that their traditional approaches to warfare were insufficient for the challenges ahead. You're asking us to surrender control of our military forces to humans we've never even heard of, Senator Crix protested. Based on threats that our own intelligence networks haven't detected and tactics we know nothing about. Marcus spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice cutting through the protests with quiet authority. You're welcome to handle this threat using your existing military doctrine. Form committees, establish diplomatic protocols, build bigger versions of the same weapons you've been using for the past 1,000 years. When that approach fails, and your civilizations are facing extinction, the offer will still be on the table. He looked around the room at each of the major military commanders. But understand that every day you spend debating and politicizing this decision is a day that could have been spent preparing for a war that will determine whether your species continues to exist. The bluntness of his statement sent a shock through the assembled delegates. They were accustomed to diplomatic language, careful phrasing, and indirect communication. Marcus was speaking to them as if they were soldiers receiving a battlefield briefing rather than political leaders attending a social function. What proof do we have that human military doctrine will be effective against this threat? Demanded the representative from Andromeda Prime. Admiral Chun smiled grimly and activated one final display. This one showed a star map that focused on a specific region of Terran space, with timestamps indicating recent events. 3 weeks ago, one of their scout forces entered the outer edge of Terran territory. They sent a single automated probe to test our defenses. The display showed the probe's path through several star systems, gathering data and analyzing human military installations. What happened to it? Asked Ambassador Thekmar. Marcus answered, his expression unchanged. We let it complete its intelligence-gathering mission, then followed it home and destroyed their entire forward operating base. 17 ships, 3 manufacturing platforms, and approximately 40,000 automated combat units. The display showed the aftermath, a debris field where a major military installation had once existed. The scale of destruction was enormous, suggesting weapons and tactics that had achieved total victory against technologically superior opponents. How? High Commander Vex asked, his professional curiosity overcoming his earlier hostility. Marcus smiled for the second time that evening, and this smile was definitely predatory. We've had 3,000 years to perfect the art of killing things that are bigger, stronger, and more advanced than we are. Would you like to learn? The question hung in the air as the assembled delegates struggled to process what they had just learned. The beings they had dismissed as primitive had not only detected and engaged in advance force of the mysterious invaders, but had achieved total victory with apparently minimal losses. High Commander Vex was the first to respond, his military training overcoming his wounded pride. Show us, he said simply. Marcus nodded to Admiral Chun, who brought up a new tactical display. The hologram showed a 3-dimensional battlefield with ship positions, movement vectors, and weapon trajectories marked in different colors. The enemy probe completed its reconnaissance and attempted to return to its base. Marcus began, his voice taking on the tone of an instructor addressing students. Standard doctrine for most civilizations would be to either ignore the probe or attempt to capture it for intelligence purposes. The display showed the probe's path as it moved through Terran space, clearly gathering detailed information about human defensive installations, ship movements, and technological capabilities. Instead, we let it leave, then tracked it using passive sensors and human intelligence assets. The probe led us directly to their forward operating base, something they clearly never expected, since their technology should have made tracking impossible. Admiral Chun manipulated the display to show a larger tactical picture. The enemy base was massive, easily the size of a small moon, bristling with defensive systems and surrounded by patrol craft that dwarfed most vessels in the known galaxy. Their base was protected by energy shields that our analysis suggested would require focused fire from at least 30 capital ships to penetrate. Chun continued. They had automated defense platforms with targeting systems faster than anything in our database, and their patrol ships were armed with weapons that could destroy a battleship with single hits. The assembled delegates studied the tactical situation with growing unease. The enemy advantages seemed overwhelming. Better technology, superior firepower, defensive positions that would require enormous casualties to overcome using conventional tactics. So how did you attack such a fortified position? Asked Senator Crix. Marcus smiled that predatory smile again. We didn't attack it. We made it attack itself. The display shifted to show the actual engagement, with human ships marked in blue and enemy forces in red. What the delegates saw defied conventional military logic. Instead of massing for a direct assault, the human fleet had broken into small units that seemed to be running away from the enemy base. Our ships broadcast false distress signals indicating catastrophic system failures, Admiral Chen explained. We used gravitic mines to simulate the signatures of ships breaking apart under enemy fire. We even ejected actual debris and life pods to make the deception complete. The enemy response was swift and decisive. Their patrol ships left their defensive positions to pursue what appeared to be crippled human vessels, while their automated defense platforms attempted to target the fleeing ships at maximum range. The beauty of automated systems, Marcus continued, is that they follow predictable patterns. They're programmed to achieve maximum efficiency, which means they always respond to threats in the most logical way possible. The display showed what happened next. As the enemy ships pursued the apparently fleeing human vessels, they were drawn further and further from their base. The automated defense platforms, trying to provide covering fire for their own ships, began shooting at targets that were increasingly difficult to distinguish from their own forces. We used holographic projectors and sensor ghosts to make it appear that our ships were scattered throughout their formation, Chen explained. Their targeting systems began identifying their own ships as hostile contacts. Their automated defenses started shooting at their own patrol vessels. The delegates watched in fascination as the enemy force essentially destroyed itself. The automated systems, designed for maximum efficiency, had become so confused by false sensor readings and spoof communications that they had turned the entire engagement into a massive friendly fire incident. While they were dealing with that chaos, Marcus continued, our actual assault force approached the base from the opposite direction. Instead of trying to break through their shields, we used gravitational manipulation to collapse their power generation systems. When the shields failed, we didn't waste time with conventional weapons. The final phase of the attack showed human ships deploying weapons that were unlike anything the galactic delegates had ever seen. Instead of energy beams or projectile weapons, they released what appeared to be metallic clouds that swarmed over the enemy base. Molecular disassemblers, Admiral Chun said matter-of-factly. They break down the atomic bonds in whatever material they encounter and use the released energy to replicate themselves. Very effective against technological installations. The enemy base simply ceased to exist, converted into its component atoms within minutes. The patrol ships that hadn't been destroyed by their own defenses were finished off by human vessels that appeared to phase in and out of normal space, making them nearly impossible to target. The entire engagement lasted 14 minutes. Marcus concluded. Total human losses, 0 ships, 0 personnel. Enemy losses, complete annihilation. The silence that followed was profound. Every military commander in the room was recalculating their assumptions about human capabilities. These were not primitive warriors using brute force tactics. This was sophisticated military science applied with ruthless efficiency. How long did it take you to develop these weapons and tactics? High Commander Vex asked, his voice now showing genuine respect. 3,000 years of continuous warfare teaches you to be creative, Marcus replied. When your enemies have better technology, more resources, and numerical superiority, you learn to fight dirty. You develop weapons that turn their advantages against them. You create tactics that make their superior numbers irrelevant. Princess Zara stepped forward, her expression serious. This is what I've been trying to explain to all of you. The threats we're facing require a completely different approach to warfare. Diplomatic solutions, economic pressure, and conventional military tactics will not be sufficient. She gestured toward the human delegation. These people have survived against odds that would have destroyed any of our civilizations. They've developed military doctrines specifically designed for fighting superior opponents. They understand concepts that we've never needed to learn. Ambassador Thekmar's tentacles writhed with nervous energy. What you're showing us is essentially a complete revolution in military thinking. You're asking us to abandon strategies and tactics that have served our civilizations for millennia. I'm asking you to adapt or die, Marcus said bluntly. Your traditional strategies work fine against opponents who think like you do, who follow similar rules of engagement, who value their own survival over their objectives. But they're useless against an enemy that views you as nothing more than resources to be harvested. Admiral Chun brought up another display, this one showing projections of how the coming invasion might unfold. The models were based on observed enemy capabilities and traditional galactic military responses. If current galactic military doctrine is employed against the invasion force, she said, our projections show complete galactic civilization collapse within 18 months. Total casualties, approximately 800 billion individuals across all species. The numbers were staggering. 800 billion deaths represented more than half the total population of known galactic civilization. It would be the end of everything they had built over thousands of years of cooperation and development. However, Chin continued, if unified command structure is established under Terran military doctrine, with full cooperation from all galactic military forces, survival probability increases to approximately 60%. 60% isn't exactly inspiring confidence, Senator Crix pointed out. Marcus looked at him with an expression that conveyed decades of military experience. 60% is excellent odds when you're facing extinction. In most of the wars we've fought, we considered ourselves lucky if we had 20% survival probability going into major engagements. He looked around the room at each of the assembled delegates. The question you need to ask yourselves is simple. Are you willing to sacrifice your pride and your traditional ways of doing things for a 60% chance of survival? Or would you prefer to maintain your independence and dignity while your civilizations are consumed by an enemy that doesn't care about your politics or your feelings? Princess Zara moved closer to Marcus, taking his hand in one of her forearms. The Corvellian Empire has already made its choice. We're implementing Terran military doctrine immediately, restructuring our entire defense network according to human specifications, and placing our forces under the command of officers trained in human warfare tactics. She looked at each delegate in turn. We're inviting all of you to join this alliance, not as junior partners or subject peoples, but as equal participants in a unified defense that might actually succeed in preserving galactic civilization. The offer hung in the air as the assembled representatives struggled with the enormity of the decision they faced. Everything they thought they knew about warfare, diplomacy, and galactic politics had been turned upside down in the space of a few hours. High Commander Vex was the first to speak. What would be required of those who joined this alliance? Admiral Chen answered, her voice professional and precise. Complete military integration under unified command structure. Adoption of Terran tactical doctrines and weapon systems. Establishment of joint training programs for all military personnel. And acceptance that human officers may outrank your existing military leadership based on experience and capability rather than political considerations. The requirements were enormous, but the alternative was extinction. One by one, the assembled delegates began to realize that their choices had been reduced to adaptation or annihilation. High Commander Vex straightened to his full imposing height and made a decision that would echo through galactic history. The Draconian Military Alliance accepts the terms of this proposal. Our forces will submit to human command, doctrine effective immediately. His words sent shockwaves through the assembled delegates. Vex commanded one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy, and his civilizations had never submitted to external authority in over 2,000 years of expansion and conquest. One by one, the other military representatives followed suit. Senator Crix spoke for the Centauri Federation. Ambassador Thekmar committed the Rigelian Consortium, and even the proud Crystalline Collective agreed to the unprecedented arrangement. The speed of their acceptance spoke to how thoroughly the human demonstration had shattered their confidence in traditional approaches. "Excellent," Admiral Chin said, activating a new holographic display that showed detailed organizational charts and deployment schedules. "We'll begin immediate integration protocols. Human tactical advisors will be assigned to each of your command structures within 72 hours. Full joint training exercises will commence within 2 weeks." Marcus stepped forward, his demeanor shifting slightly from instructor to commander. "Before we proceed, everyone in this room needs to understand exactly what you've just agreed to. Human military doctrine doesn't just mean new weapons and tactics. It means accepting a completely different philosophy about war, casualties, and victory." He gestured to Admiral Chun, who brought up a series of statistical displays. In human military tradition, the preservation of civilian populations takes absolute priority over the survival of military personnel. This means that soldiers are expected to die to protect non-combatants, even when those non-combatants belong to enemy civilizations. The concept was foreign to most galactic military traditions, where protecting one's own species was the primary concern, and enemy civilians were considered acceptable casualties if necessary for victory. Additionally, Marcus continued, human doctrine requires that military personnel be prepared to sacrifice themselves to achieve strategic objectives, even when those objectives don't provide immediate benefit to their home worlds or species. Princess Zara nodded approvingly. This is why the Corvellian Empire chose to ally with humanity. Not just because of their military capabilities, but because their ethical framework aligns with the kind of galactic civilization we want to preserve. Admiral Chun manipulated the display to show deployment projections. Over the next 6 months, we'll be establishing joint training facilities on 47 worlds throughout galactic space. Every military officer above the rank of lieutenant will undergo intensive retraining in human warfare doctrines. "What about our existing command structures?" asked High Commander Vex. "They'll be preserved wherever possible," Admiral Chin replied. "However, overall strategic command will be exercised by human officers with extensive combat experience. Your existing commanders will serve as specialists in their areas of expertise: fleet coordination, logistics, species-specific tactics." Marcus activated another display showing weapon schematics and technological specifications. "We'll also be sharing selected human military technologies: molecular disassemblers, gravitic manipulation systems, phase-shift defensive networks, and adaptive tactical AI systems. The technologies shown were decades ahead of anything possessed by galactic civilizations. Energy weapons that could adjust their output to overcome any known defensive system, ships that could temporarily exist outside normal space-time to avoid enemy targeting, and artificial intelligence systems that could adapt to enemy tactics faster than biological minds could process information. The cost for this technology transfer and military integration will be significant," Admiral Chin warned. "Not in monetary terms, but in terms of social and political changes required to support this new approach to warfare." Princess Zara elaborated on this point. "Human military doctrine requires that your entire civilizations be oriented toward supporting the war effort. This means resource allocation, industrial production, and scientific research all focused on military applications until the threat is eliminated." The implications were staggering. It meant converting their peaceful, trade-oriented societies into military-industrial complexes dedicated to warfare. For civilizations that had known peace for centuries, the transition would be traumatic. "How long do we have to complete this transformation?" asked the crystalline representative. Marcus consulted with Admiral Chun before responding. "Based on current enemy movement patterns and resource consumption rates, we estimate they'll reach the outer territories of galactic space within 8 to 10 years. Full military preparedness needs to be achieved within 6 years to provide adequate defensive capabilities. 6 years to completely transform multiple galactic civilizations from peaceful traders and diplomats into hardened military societies." The timeline seemed impossible, but the alternative was extinction. "What about casualties?" Senator Crix asked quietly. "In this kind of total warfare you're describing, what level of losses should we expect?" The question that everyone had been avoiding was finally spoken aloud. Marcus's expression grew somber as he considered his response. In the conflicts we've fought in Terran space, he said slowly, military casualties typically range from 30 to 60% of engaged forces. Civilian casualties were generally kept below 5% of total population through strategic evacuation and defensive positioning. The numbers were sobering. Military forces could expect to lose more than half their personnel in major engagements. But civilian survival rates would be far higher than anything achievable through traditional galactic military doctrine. However, Admiral Chen added, those casualty rates were achieved against enemies with technological parity or slight advantages. Against the current threat, with unified command and improved defensive strategies, we're projecting military casualties of approximately 40% and civilian casualties below 2%. High Commander Vex nodded slowly. Those are acceptable losses for the preservation of galactic civilization. Marcus looked around the room one final time. Before we proceed with formal alliance agreements, I want everyone to understand one crucial point. Once this process begins, there's no going back to your previous ways of doing things. The social, political, and economic changes required to support total warfare will permanently alter your civilizations. Princess Zara smiled and moved to stand beside Marcus. That's exactly what we're hoping for. Our current galactic civilization is soft, complacent, and unprepared for the realities of a hostile universe. Perhaps it's time we learn to be stronger. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything in galactic history. Instead of the elaborate diplomatic protocols typically required for major treaties, the alliance agreements were signed with military efficiency. Each civilization committed their entire military forces to human command, accepted complete technological integration, and agreed to societal restructuring as required for total warfare. As the delegates filed out to begin the massive task of transforming their civilizations, Marcus and Princess Zara remained in the ballroom, finally, alone except for their personal guards. Do you think they understand what they've agreed to? Zara asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. They understand that their survival depends on adaptation. Whether they truly comprehend the scope of changes required, that remains to be seen. And do you think our alliance will be successful in stopping the invasion? Marcus looked out through the transparent aluminum windows at the stars beyond the space station. Somewhere out there, an enemy force was systematically consuming everything in its path, growing stronger with each conquest, moving inexorably toward inhabited space. Honestly, 60% survival probability is optimistic. We're facing an enemy that's had time to perfect their war machine while consuming the resources of multiple galaxies. They've probably fought and defeated dozens of civilizations more advanced than anything we have here. Zara nodded, unsurprised by his assessment. But you believe the fight is worth undertaking? Marcus turned back to her with that predatory smile she had come to appreciate. I believe that going down fighting is always preferable to accepting extinction quietly. And who knows, maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe these soft, diplomatic civilizations will surprise everyone and discover they have more fight in them than anyone expected, including themselves, especially themselves. Outside, the great ships of the assembled fleets began to move toward their home systems, carrying the news that would transform galactic civilization forever. The age of peace and prosperity was ending. The age of total warfare was about to begin. And for the first time in galactic history, they had a fighting chance of survival. The humans had entered galactic society not as primitives seeking acceptance, but as the teachers that soft civilizations never knew they needed. The laughter that had greeted Princess Zara's choice of husband had been replaced by the grim determination of species preparing for the fight of their lives. Marcus Kane, the human they had dismissed as unworthy, was now the supreme commander of the largest military alliance in galactic history. And as he stood beside his bride-to-be, watching the future of multiple civilizations set in motion by their decisions, he allowed himself one moment of satisfaction. They had been laughing at the human bride. Now they would learn what it meant when humans chose to fight back.